This is Eric Alexander, Six Arrows Consulting. Let's talk about scar tissue. I'll tell you in a minute why I want to talk about scar tissue, but across my body, I've got scar tissue in several places. None of it's really prominent, none of it's too disfiguring, but a lot of it comes from the relics of my teenage and preteen years where shenanigans or feats of valor went awry in some way. The male brain does not really form good judgment until quite a bit later, and I'm a good example of that. In several instances, it involved a skateboard. In other instances, maybe a pocket knife, but scar tissue. There's some scar tissue on my body. Here's why that came to mind. This week, I finished reading a book by Stephen M.R. Covey, Trust and Inspire. It's a good follow up to an earlier book he wrote called The Speed of Trust, which is brilliant and has been really helpful for me personally and also as I'm working with leaders. And in this Trust and Inspire, towards the end, he makes a statement about policies in organizations. And let me read a quick quote. He says, policies, and I'd say the same thing could be true about a lot of our processes, are organizational scar tissue. And a lot of it arises from, quote, being burned from when trust went awry. So let's just pause and think about that for a little bit. How many times do we make a change to a policy because somebody did something stupid? Somebody turned in an expense reimbursement form to accounts payable for things that clearly were inappropriate use of funds. Maybe they were obviously for personal use. Me buying Christmas presents for my wife. No, that's not a good use of the bank's resources when I'm working for the bank. Or me spending an unreasonable amount of money on a meal when I'm traveling or things like that. Often we write policies and we tighten up the processes and the policies because people have abused trust in the past. Or sometimes this will happen. Somebody will make a decision in the business. Maybe it's a hiring decision, maybe it's a spending decision, a commitment on a contract, without thinking through who all the other people are that need to know about the decision or maybe need to be consulted before the decision's finalized. And so what do? We back up and we put policies and processes in place to make sure the right people are informed. There's a good place for that. There's a good place for making sure our policies and procedures reflect risk and are appropriate for the decisions and expenditures and other stewardship things that happen. But they can go crazy overboard. They can get burdensome. They can become unreasonable. And I think trust, as Covey writes about in both of the books, is a good frame for thinking about it, both from the side of the ones that have to follow the policies and from the ones that are enforcing or writing the policies. First of all, as you're writing policies, think through what's reasonable. What would a reasonable person do? Yes, pay attention to how abuses could happen, but there can be ways to deal with abuses without making it burdensome for the 97% of the people who will attempt to do it in a non-fraudulent way. So think about writing it in a way that's not burdensome, but reflects trying to make it nimble, make it easy to flow through while appropriately protecting and being good stewards of resources and priorities and strategic initiatives and things like that. One of the things that can be overlooked is I'm protecting the company by making this rigid, but we overlook the cost of that rigidity in loss of speed, loss of nimbleness. I'm not saying ignore fraud or ignore bad actors, but I'm saying for the sake of those who generally will be trustworthy, build the policies and the procedures in a way that lets people of goodwill act in an appropriate way as good stewards without burdening them with, dang it, all these other people did it wrong in the past, and we're going to make sure you don't do it wrong this time. So as you're writing the policies, that helps. If you're one that's responsible for following the policies, living through the processes, you can help your own case. You can build a case for lightening up appropriately by making sure you're trustworthy, by making sure you are acting and thinking as a good steward. Maybe it's time you're going to take a client out for a meal. Yes, make sure the client has a good time and feels like you and the company appreciate them. But it doesn't have to be the most extravagant place in town necessarily. Think through what would be appropriate stewardship of the company's funds. Let's say it's a decision, it's a contract decision, spending decision, hiring decision. pause and think who else might need to be part of this conversation before we make the decision. You may have the right and appropriately to do it yourself. Are there others, though, that should be consulted? Are there others who really need to sign off on it and offer their perspective? Slow down for a minute and think. Think specifically, how can I be a good steward of this decision? How can I be a good steward of these resources? As we demonstrate trustworthiness, it makes it easier for those who are creating the policies and enforcing policies to not have to tighten them up and create all that, those layers and crusts of scar tissue from when people really prove themselves not to be trustworthy in the past. Something to think about. Thanks for listening.